pleasure is mine to be invited by Sia and Rod and the group. It's an important, as you said, there are not too many people globally like really taking on to do research on disasters and conflicts. So it's really great to be here and talk to you. And I might already spoil that I'm drawing on your work quite extensively in my forthcoming book, of which my talk today is mostly based. So let me see whether I can share my screen. Can you see that?
Yes, we can, but we can see the whole PowerPoint, not only, you're not on presentation mode yet.
Yes. But I will go there eventually. Slideshow. Now we should be better.
Yeah, perfect.
Cool. Okay. So the topic of the presentation is how disasters shape the dynamics of armed conflicts, which is the subtitle of a book I have coming out with MIT Press. Hopefully around this time next year, it will be out already. And the project has been funded by a grant from the Australian Research Council, so to acknowledge that. But I mean, really the starting point for that is, so this is actually, like, these two graphics are actually the starting point of the research. So on the left, you can see these are the trends for various like climate and climate-related and in natural hazard-related disasters. And the very left is the reported events. Then in the middle, you have the reported fatalities per 1,000 people. Then you have on the right, you have the damage in billion. And you see over the past 3 or actually 4 decades, you have an upwards trend more or less strong for most indicators. And I mean, with climate change going on, with persistent inequality and marginalization, with urbanization and other trends, it's actually not very surprising to see that the frequency and intensity of extreme events and actually the disasters that result from these events and the underlying vulnerability are actually increasing. And then on the right side, you have the number of armed conflicts per year, most of them within states, because international wars have been very rare since 1946. Even so, they are pretty high on the agenda these days. And I mean, as you can see, the number of armed conflicts altogether has been increasing since the end of the Second World War, then took a dip in the 90s, early 2000s, but is now basically since 2016 way above 50 for several years in a row. So we see in the last, let's say, decade also a trend of an increasing number of armed conflicts worldwide. And I mean, if we have the frequency and intensity of disasters growing and the level of armed conflicts on a very high level, by definition, we will have more disasters striking armed conflict areas, particularly as armed conflict areas are usually very, very vulnerable to disasters because of a lack of preparation, infrastructure destruction, and so on. Which let me ask the question, what actually happens when disasters strike armed conflict areas or countries with an ongoing active armed conflict? And that's actually something we know surprisingly little about. So if you're a bit familiar with literature on disasters, climate change, and conflict, you will know there's a large debate on how disasters like the 2007-8 drought in Syria impact the risk of armed conflict onset, and a bit of work on armed conflict incidents. You have same debates for Syria and for Sudan, and more recently for the Lake Chad region and Boko Haram. But we actually have very little research on what happens when disasters affect ongoing armed conflicts. And most of the research we have is actually focusing on Aceh, where an armed conflict area was hit by an armed conflict, and a few months later we had a peace agreement signed there. While in Sri Lanka, had hit by the same tsunami in 2004, the armed conflict escalated. And apart from these two, I'd say, textbook cases, we have very little knowledge. And I say that's a crucial knowledge gap, not just in terms of wider debates about conflict dynamics or about the security risks associated with climate change, but also in terms of policymaking, because in the end, if armed conflicts intensify after a disaster hits, I mean, that would have severe consequences for, say, humanitarian assistance providers or peace-building operations. And if armed conflicts would rather tend to de-escalate after disasters, that would open up a window for perhaps renewed negotiations, and therefore be highly interested for, let's say, negotiators, but perhaps also for the ones who want to move in and deliver humanitarian aid. So that's basically the core question. What happens if we have an ongoing civil war between a government and a rebel group? Then we have a major disaster, usually more than 1,000 deaths, striking the country in conflict, usually the armed conflict zone. And to basically deal with this, I developed a theoretical framework, which is summarized in this table. And as you see, it's a bit more detailed, so I won't go into it, but rather roughly go over it and explain give a few examples. So the idea is basically, I'm assuming that disasters can lead both to conflict escalation and conflict de-escalation, depending on and of course, sometimes they have no impact on the conflict, but I mean, that's not what the project seeks to explain. And then on the left side, I'm assuming that disasters or that conflicts can be basically driven by three sets of factors. The one is the motivation of the groups or the individuals that are involved in the conflict or the groups that they represent. The second one is strategic factors, mostly linked to military strategies and military success. And the third one is actually the desire of parties to conflict to communicate and to send messages to all kinds of audiences. And that leads to basically 6 different impacts disasters could have on conflict dynamics, at least in theory. So the first one being grievances, and that's like on the upper left side. So grievances, basically you have a disaster striking an area, the people being like very annoyed about the government not providing adequate support or disaster preparation, then fueling their grievances into support for the armed groups, which enables them to recruit more followers, gather more resources, challenge the state. And the opposite of that is basically the solidarity impact, which draws on a large literature on disaster sociology, basically arguing that, well, in the aftermath of disasters, there's increasing solidarity and cooperation in the face of a joint external challenge. So cleavages are a bit less relevant in the post-disaster period. That could translate into less local contention and consequentially less conflict. From a strategy perspective, disasters provide opportunities both for the state, for instance, to gather intelligence when delivering disaster aid, and then use that intelligence to deliver, well executed blows against rebel headquarters. But also both pro-government militia groups and rebels can exploit that people that are affected by disaster have lost their livelihoods, have few economic choices, and might be more willing to join an armed group simply because they have very little to lose and very little alternatives to earn an income. But then on the other hand, of course, disasters also put constraints on armed groups, be it that infrastructure is destroyed and you can't move your troops around, being that both the state and the rebels are less able to tax the local populations, meaning they have less money on their disposal to fuel, to feed into their armed conflicts. Then when it comes to the communication perspective, I mean, the use of violence is usually a very credible signal. So imagine a rebel group being hit after a disaster, and both from the external sponsors, from the government, from the population that's supporting the rebels, there's really doubt whether perhaps not there were bases destroyed, revenues lost, fighters perished in the disasters. So whether the group is still willing and capable to continue the armed conflict. So perhaps the group just, staged a few attacks on a military base or civilians here and there just to demonstrate, to send a signal to a wider audience saying, look, we are still there, we are capable, we are willing, the disaster didn't affect us. But actually the other thing could also go on, that a rebel group, but also a government restrain strategically to send a message, because both when it comes to international supporters, but also to domestic audiences, usually it's not well received if you stage up your armed activities in the aftermath of a disaster, rather than using that resources for disaster aid. It's usually not very well received. So people might restrain from violence, even so they could use more violent or could do more fighting just to cultivate their image and show that they are the responsible, benevolent people, or the responsible, benevolent group. And I think the Taliban, for instance, providing COVID-19 assistance in the areas they control is perhaps one of the clearest examples of that. So with this framework in mind, I collected qualitative data via interviews and it's mostly desk-based research. So a few interviews and then reading basically everything that I could find in the academic literature and newspapers and reports, both on the disaster and the conflict. And I had a sample of 36 cases in 20 countries, spread all across the world. As I said, usually the disaster had more than 1,000 fatalities. So what did I find out of the sample? Let me just drink a bit. Okay. So in terms of the conflict dynamics, I found that in 18 cases, the disaster had no impact on the conflict dynamics. In 9 cases, the disaster facilitated an escalation of the conflict, and in another 9, it de-escalated, which, it looks very symmetric, but it's really by coincidence. And I think it's an interesting finding in at least 3 aspects. The first one being that, in 1/4 of the cases, there is significant escalation of the conflict after the disaster and partially related to the disaster. Usually the disaster is not the most important factor, but it played a role. And that basically means that when we talk about climate change and disasters and security implications, there is something also when it comes to conflict intensity that we should take this serious. However, this link is by no means deterministic, and in the large majority of cases, 50%, actually the disaster had no impact at all on the conflict dynamics. And the good news is even that in another 1/4 of the cases, there is de-escalation. And I think that directly challenges these, I'd say, unidirectional narratives in environmental security and climate conflict research that just asks, okay, we have climate change, does it increase conflict risks, yes or no? And this whole question of, does it actually decrease conflict risks? Could be there like more an conflict de-escalating impact is rarely considered at all. So how do we do in terms of the 6 theoretical pathways or impacts that I just specified a minute ago? We basically see, and this is like how many cases are covered by which of the explanations. Some cases are covered by more than one explanation, and the dark gray bar of the barrier is like where the evidence is pretty solid, and the light gray area is where the evidence is a bit more ambitious, and it's not sure whether the whether the impact of the disaster was actually minor or very, very minor. So that's the case where there's a bit more uncertainty, and the disaster impact was also most likely a bit weaker. And we find that the motivation perspective, so both grievances and solidarity, is actually very little explanatory power. And that's mostly because, I mean, there have been intense grievances and protests after disasters. And likewise, in a lot of the cases, there have been increases in local solidarity and cooperation, but they were usually localized, short-term, and did not translate into a change in armed conflict dynamics. And that feels quite logical from this perspective, because I mean, if my house is washed away by a flood and the government doesn't do something about it, I mean, it's fairly easy for me to go somewhere and protest. That's one thing, but to take up arms and join a rebel group, do something illegal and dangerous, that's a whole different level. And usually the local grievances and solidarity do not translate to that level. We see that the strategy perspective explains by far the most cases and has the most explanatory power. And we see that the communication perspective is not too strong when it comes to conflict escalation, but it does fairly well when it comes to conflict de-escalation. This is mostly because of large-scale disasters or disasters that catalyzed a lot of international interest, like the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami in Aceh, the 1999 Manara earthquake in Turkey, or the 2005 earthquake in the Kashmir region. Lots of casualties, lots of international attention, very close scrutiny. So the conflict parties actually restrained to cultivate their image, at least for a few months. I mean, I should have said it earlier on. The general time frame for this analysis is 1 year after the disaster. So as I said, opportunities and constraints seem to be the most relevant impacts. So when it comes for opportunities for rebel groups, the most frequent opportunities actually enhanced recruitment opportunities of deprived or partially aggrieved disaster victims, and also the preoccupation of government forces which had to move to the disaster area that was lacking. I mean, basically, if you move 60,000 soldiers to help with an earthquake response, it stretches out the state military quite a bit, and rebel groups try to use that to, scale up the military activities. And when it comes to constraints, the most frequent constraints are, first of all, financial trouble. So basically, government and rebels no longer being able to tax their constituencies or even to invest money in the disaster response, which is lacking somewhere else. Then reduced troop mobility, mostly because areas were flooded or infrastructure like bridges, streets were destroyed. But also, the reallocation of resources. So basically the state having to reallocate money and sometimes also equipment to the disaster affected areas, and then hence being not able, like after the 1999 Armenia earthquake in Colombia, just the economy, the coffee economy collapsing, state channeling a lot of money from the appeasement and infrastructure investment program. That's new. Can anyone else see that?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay.
I will try to erase it. I think I will take care of that. Maybe give me a moment, please.
Very strange.
Yeah. No worries. So anyway, let me just continue.
I would suggest you stop sharing your screen, eh?
Okay.
Okay, we can continue now.
Okay, shall I reshare it?
Yes, please.
Okay, let me see, where have I been?
It's coming back.
It looks to me like someone is in the webinar who should be there and does that stuff.
Yes, but I have
It's the first time that I see something like this.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be because I have enabled the waiting room, so I don't know how
We
to.
have an artist in the audience.
Oh yeah, increase one more level the security of the Zoom, so that should be okay now. Let's try again, please.
Ah, nice.
Continue. Yeah.
By the way, do you see there's a question, Tobias? I don't know if you have time for that in the meantime. Oh.
No, because the chat doesn't pop up when I'm in
No,
present
that's
mode.
true. That's true. Shall I read it out now, or would you prefer to just continue and then we do the questions afterwards? Maybe that's better, huh?
Yes, unless it's something directly related that
No. Let's
inhibits
continue.
understanding.
Let's
Okay.
continue now, and then I thought maybe it will take a while, and then we could have done it. Okay.
Okay, easy peasy. So this is a bit of more another visual representation of the project design. I then also run a QCA, qualitative comparative analysis. I will not go into the technical details. If you're interested, feel free to ask, but I will mostly present the results here. So in the first step, I asked what's actually separating the cases where disasters have an impact on conflict dynamics from the cases where this does not happen, no matter in which direction. And I found, voila, here we go. Yeah. So I found it's mostly happening in contexts where disaster vulnerability is high, which is either in countries which have a very high agricultural dependence, or in countries which have low levels of development, which is measured here by under 5 mortality rates. And the second condition is that at least one conflict party needs to be negatively affected by the disaster. If one of these conditions is missing, usually there's no impact of the disaster on conflict dynamics. Now, how can we tell apart the escalation and de-escalation cases? That's perhaps the more relevant question. So escalation, and for both there are two scenarios very common. The first one is escalation if the balance of power shifts towards the rebels. So usually if the rebels perceive or actually think that either they gain from the disaster and the government does not, or more often the government suffers from the disaster and the rebels don't, rebels quite often try to escalate the conflicts and use the period of temporary weakness. The other explanation is actually that the constituencies, like the group the rebels are fighting for, are usually affected by the disaster, articulate local grievances, the rebels react to that, but the state is actually quite strong and capable and retaliates, which causes conflict intensity to go up. And my argument would be, once we see those conditions on the ground, we should be very, very careful to send in humanitarian aid, or we should at least exert a lot of pressure on the conflict parties to, not scale up violence and to allow the delivery of humanitarian aid. De-escalation usually happens if the rebel groups are weakened by the disaster and then the state is unable to exploit it, either because the state is very weak, has no presence in the area, or is negatively affected by the disaster itself, or if the other thing is basically wrong. The state is weakened by the disaster, at least in the area where the disaster happened, and the rebels are unable to exploit it because they have very low capabilities, or they're unable to exploit the situation as well. Okay, how am I doing time-wise? I could have like a very short empirical example, or I could skip to the conclusion.
Well, I love examples, so I think they will clarify a lot. So I definitely encourage you to give the example, and you're doing great. Yeah.
Okay. I have one example and I have another one in the backup slides, and I could talk to a few more perhaps in the Q&A. And I promise I will make those very short. So in Somalia, it's perhaps a well-known case that, Rod, I think you need to mute yourself so I can't hear the ambulance in the background. Somalia basically had a coalition of rebel forces fighting against the dictator Barre, which was finally overthrown in 1992. by the United Somali Congress. But as soon as the United Somali Congress rebels won over the government, they split. And I mean, there were also rifts between them and other rebel groups and warlords, but I mean, the most important split was between the two United Somali Congress, one led by Mahdi and the other one by Aidid. So these are the two fractions. That they had two organizations, the same name, and they were fighting for government power, and they were fighting mostly in two regions, the one being Mogadishu, the capital city, and then the southwestern corner of the country, because that's like, you can say, the breadbasket of the region. So that's where you get food, and that's where you also get cattle and bananas, which were in the 90s the main export goods of Somalia. And initially, the conflict, both before 1992, but also when it became more like fractionalized failed state conflicts, was highly based on clan loyalty. So basically, each warlord or each faction represented a certain clan or an alliance of clans. But as the armed conflict went on, let's say roughly around 1995, the association between the conflict parties and the local populations and the clans weakened significantly, which meant in order to sustain their military efforts, the conflict parties had to pay their fighters and to feed their fighters, so to fight for them. And there's a specific Somali term, which I can't remember right now, for these kind of paid fighters that fought in the Civil War. But I can look it up once I'm done with the presentation. 1997, major El Nino event, large floods, like 1 in 100-year floods along the Juba and Shabelle River in southwestern Somalia, which had essentially two impacts. First, as I said, this was one of the two regions where a lot of the fighting going on. Now with 20 to 30% of the area effectively underwater, it's effectively really hard to move your troops around and get them fighting each other because, well, I mean, if the road is flooded, if the desert is flooded, if the area is flooded, you can't really move the troops around very effectively. So that's one of the reasons why the conflict intensity significantly declined in the year after the disaster. The other one being that food prices skyrocketed. I think some basic staples more than 200%, if I remember correctly. And I mean, basically, if you're in a stage of an armed group where you have to feed your fighters and you pay like more than twice the amount of money for the same food, it means that unless you have much more revenues, you have less fighters, you could pay less fighters, which means the armed conflict intensity goes down as well. And if I say unless you raise more revenues, what actually happened was a massive loss of revenues, because the Aidid fraction was mainly driving on banana export, and 30% of the banana plantations were just destroyed by the floods. The Mahdi fraction was mostly driving by export of cattle. Now with the floods, certain disease called cattle fever spread around in the region, which made both Saudi Arabia and Kenya, the main importers, ban cattle imports from Somalia, which means you can't raise money through cattle anymore, you can't raise money from bananas anymore, and you have to pay more money to feed your fighters, which in the end, at least for, let's say, a period of 6 to 8 months, severely undermined the capability of the warring USC fractions to fight each other, leading to a conflict decline, which, I mean, didn't really resolve the conflict, but at least resulted in a temporary de-escalation of the conflict. So, key takeaway points. I don't have a nice title page of the book, so just thought I make up this to see how it looks like. So, main takeaway points. So disaster conflicts are clearly non-deterministic and multidirectional. Depending on the conflict, disasters can have an escalating, de-escalating, or no impact at all on conflict dynamics. And that those challenges narratives that say disasters and climate change are not related to conflict at all, but also determinist links of disasters increase conflict risks. And particularly, it urges us to pay much more attention to at least temporarily decreased conflict risks after disasters. The opportunity and to a lower degree the communication mechanisms are the key explanatory factors, which is quite important in understanding, like the pathways and the theory behind these findings. Disasters can be opportunities for peace, and I mean disasters mostly lead to like negative short-term declines in hostilities, which is very, very negative peace, if you want to say so. But we also know from the literature on mediation and peace processes that quite often that negotiations are much more successful both at the initiation and at the conclusion stage at times when there's less conflict and less violence, simply because there are less spoilers for the negotiations. So in that case, decreased conflict intensity after disasters can provide at least opportunities for these sorts of negotiations. And my argument would be that these findings, which are mainly derived from natural hazards and disasters, droughts, floods, storms, earthquakes, tsunamis, might also be applicable to other sorts of external shocks, for instance, COVID-19. And actually, there is a chapter on COVID-19 which shows that many of the findings have some relevance for the pandemic as well. But you could also think about steep rises or falls of global commodity prices. You could think of economic shocks, global economic shocks that oscillate through the world markets. Which might have very similar impacts than the disasters. And yeah, that's my key points. As I said, I'm happy to elaborate on the cases, on the methodology, on the theory. It's hard to summarize 300 pages in a few minutes, but I feel that's why I appreciate the interactive nature of such webinars.